Well, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. Tonight, I've been asked to address the subject, God and Girls, is Christianity bad news for women? And I think it's true to say that it can be very uncomfortable for religious people, people of faith, to hear what other people think about their beliefs, or really honestly think about their beliefs. In fact, straight talking in general can be uncomfortable. It's said that lawyers should never ask a Mississippi grandmother a question if they aren't prepared for the answer. The story is told of a trial in the South, in Mississippi, in America, a small town, and a lawyer prosecuting his first trial. He called his first witness to the stand, a rather grandmotherly elderly woman, and wanting to give her an easy start, he asked her a simple question. The question was, "Mrs. Jones, do you know me?" She responded without hesitation, "Oh yes, Mr. Williams, I've known you since you were a boy, and frankly, you've been a big disappointment to me. You lie, you cheat on your wife, and you manipulate people, and you talk about them behind their backs. You think you're a big shot, and you haven't the brains to realise that you'll never amount to anything more than a two-bit paper pusher. Yes, I know you." The lawyer was stunned, and not really knowing how to recover from this first question he'd ever asked in a trial, he pointed across the courtroom at the defence. And he said, "Mrs. Jones, do you know the defence lawyer?" She again replied without hesitation, "Oh yes, I do. I've known Mr. Bradley since he was a youngster too. He's lazy, bigoted, and he has a drinking problem. He can't build a normal relationship with anyone, and his law practice is one of the worst in the entire state. Not to mention he cheated on his wife with 3 different women, and one of them was your wife. Yes, I know him." The defence lawyer, Mr. Bradley, nearly died. At this point, the judge asked both lawyers to approach the bench. And in a very quiet voice, he said, "If either of you 2 idiots asks her if she knows me, I'll send you both to the electric chair." An honest description can be uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. If we were to do a survey amongst the people of Sydney and ask them questions about what they really thought about Christianity, what they really thought about the Bible, lots of words might appear, and they might not all be particularly complimentary. And that means that we find ourselves at an interesting juxtaposition. Many people today perceive Christianity primarily negatively on moral grounds. And yet we live in a culture in which the Bible and Christian faith in particular has bequeathed us a massively positive inheritance. We look at the impact of Christian faith and biblical thinking on our most fundamental law, much of which has been drawn from the 10 Commandments: do not murder, do not steal, and so forth. Or we might look at the establishment of the rights and dignity of human persons, evidenced in movements like the suffragette movement, who quoted the Bible in their campaign for votes for women, or movements like the abolition movement, championed by William Wilberforce, whose driving motivation in his longing to see an end to the transatlantic slave trade was a vision for justice that he read in his Bible. Echoed perhaps in the civil rights movement with Dr. Martin Luther King, who famously longed for justice to roll down like a mighty river, and drew inspiration for his "I Have a Dream" speech from the prophets Amos and Isaiah. Or perhaps we might look to the Make Poverty History campaign, the dropping of third world debt, which was largely started and championed and then maintained by churches and Christian groups. In fact, in my own country, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, in December of the year 2000, gave a speech announcing the cancelling of billions of pounds of third world debt from 41 countries owed to Britain. To where did he turn for the inspiration for his speech, the opening paragraph began with a quotation from the prophet Isaiah in chapter 61. Or today, the anti-human trafficking campaign taking on the massive issue of sex slavery in our world is largely championed by Christians, motivated by what they read in the Bible, about the value of every human life, rooted in the idea that all human beings are made in the image of God and deserve to be treated with dignity. Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 says, "So God created humanity in his own image. In his image, in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." This is not a survival of the fittest worldview, where the elimination of the weak by the strong is accepted. After all, we could ask ourselves the question this evening, why not be sexist? Why not dominate or subjugate other human beings? At least a part of the answer, if I'm a Christian, is that the Bible tells me that all human life has a transcendent source, that humanity bears the divine image, and therefore it matters how people are treated. I will be held to account for how I have lived. My actions and decisions now have a relevance not just today, but into eternity. In the context of women today in the West, that message of the essential dignity and humanity of male and female is both powerful and countercultural. And I want to explore for a moment just 3 ways in which it is countercultural by sketching out the current situation that women in the West face today. The first phenomena is what sociologists call objectification. Objectification simply means to construe an individual person as an object. And what sociologists have noticed is that construing individuals as an object has led to women being perceived, when objectified, as less competent and, by virtue of becoming an object, less than human. Women are assessed by physical attributes as sexual objects on a comprehensive scale in the Western world. One writer comments that an entire gender exists purely to satisfy others' desires. That phenomena of objectification has led to a second phenomenon called self-objectification. And that is that modern industrialized society chronically and pervasively objectifies the female body. And that has led to many women coming to view themselves through the lens of an external observer, habitually monitoring their own appearance and behaviour, whether in public or private settings, through the perspective of somebody viewing them. The negative effects associated with self-objectification include body shame, appearance anxiety, depression, and disordered eating. So in this room, if we have an interest in the education of young women, which I'm sure we do in a girls' school, it's strikingly important and relevant to that task today of raising and educating a generation of young women. This process of self-objectification, one study in 2016, addressed how objectifying a woman affects the way that she is perceived by others as well as the way she perceives herself. The authors hypothesized that focusing on a woman's appearance promotes reduced perceptions of her competence, and by virtue of construing a woman as an object, promotes perceptions of women as less human. Objectification, self-objectification, and then a third phenomenon, the phenomenon of sexual violence. In Britain, The Guardian reported in 2016 on research from the Trade Unions Congress and the Everyday Sexism Project that 52% of women reported experiencing unwanted behaviour in the workplace. 52%. And that included groping, sexual advances, and inappropriate jokes. Among women aged 16 to 24, that statistic rose from 52% to 63%. The Telegraph reported in 2015 on polling conducted by YouthSite that 1/3 of university students who were female in Britain had endured a sexual assault or an unwanted advance. 34% of intellectual women pursuing studies at university had experienced some kind of abuse or assault. I suggest to you this evening that a philosophy that challenges these realities of objectification, self-objectification, and violence by proclaiming the humanity, full and equal humanity of women as dignified creatures, created, valued, sacred, made in the image of God, that would be good news and that it would be radically countercultural today. But I hear you say, hold on a minute. Can we seriously hold up the church as any kind of example? Haven't believers in God colluded with slavery, the racial segregation agenda? Haven't priests claiming to serve God abused children in their care? And haven't church hierarchies helped to cover up that abuse? Don't corrupt individuals today prey on vulnerable people in churches and cheat them out of money in the name of God? As a consequence of these and other realities, many people feel that Christianity is morally bad news for people, as it patently has worked out that way at different points in history. And many people feel that it is bad news for women in particular. This is a serious subject before us tonight. How has Christianity been bad news for women? Well, one way would be the idea of restricted roles or spheres of life that are open to women, with many other spheres of life or roles being closed to them. Yet, as we will see, women in the Bible played all kinds of different roles. My doctoral research was around a woman called Dorothy L. Sayers and her writing and thinking. She was one of the beneficiaries of belonging to the first cohort of women to graduate from Oxford in 1920. Sayers called to mind the pioneers of university training for women who had demanded that women should be admitted to universities and allowed to graduate. And she talks about having the question repeatedly posed to them, why should women want to know about Aristotle? The idea was women are in this one sphere of life, and why should they want to enter this other sphere of life? She replied, the answer is not that all women would want to know about Aristotle, but simply what women want as a class is irrelevant. I want to know about Aristotle. It is true that most women care nothing about him, but I, eccentric individual that I am, do want to know about Aristotle, and I submit that there is nothing in my shape or bodily functions which need prevent my knowing about him. Women have been restricted to particular spheres or roles, and sometimes people in the church have reinforced that. But that doesn't ring true to what the Bible says. Or secondly, perhaps women have been portrayed as seducers to be feared. Women scapegoated and blamed for the problems of the world. Blamed for sexual violence, your skirt was too short, or it was the woman's fault for looking too alluring, or she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And some academics have tried to trace this phenomenon of scapegoating women back to the Eve story, citing this story in that general trend of scapegoating women. Yet, this flies in the face of the essential equality of male and female, rooted in transcendent grounds that I noted from Genesis chapter 1, as well as the independent volition, the capacity of a woman to make a choice, Eve, that is undergirded and rooted in that Genesis narrative of Adam and Eve. How has Christianity been bad news for women? Well, restricting people's spheres or scapegoating women, or perhaps the example of women being denied the vote, and arguments being made within the church that because of male headship, people would be against female suffrage. The arguments offered in that context were, well, women and men have separate spheres. Most women don't want the vote. Women's roles are in local affairs, or women are already represented by their husbands. Yet, the suffragettes adopted symbolic Christian figures, as well as the structure and tactics of contemporary Christian organisations. They infused their rhetoric, both their autobiographical accounts and their novels and their slogans, with the language of Christian theology. They were inspired by what they read in the Bible for their campaign. The suffragist Helena Swanwick wrote in her autobiography of 1935, I Have Been Young, saying, "Let there be no mistake about it. This movement was not primarily political. It was social, moral, psychological, and profoundly religious." Christianity may have been bad news for women in all sorts of examples that we might be able to draw out. But as we approach this subject, this bigger subject, God and girls, is Christianity bad for women? On what basis, ultimately, should we judge the question? Undoubtedly, from personal experience, some will say the church has had or been bad news for me, or even good news for me. But in this wider cultural context today of objectification, this question is crucial. Does the Christian worldview have anything to say to a culture that objectifies women? Is there a coherent intellectual basis for the dignity of humanity, male and female? I want to suggest to you this evening that to settle this question, we really would need to go back to the original source material. We would need to ask, are the one-off experiences we may have had, positive or negative, are they warranted by the Christ of the New Testament? Are they warranted by the texts that he upheld and the source material about him? What does the Bible have to say about this question? Well, when we come to the Old Testament, there are numerous images of women. One image that springs to mind that comes early on in Genesis is the image of Eve as Adam's helper. Now, I don't know what the mental picture that springs into your mind when you hear that metaphor, that image is. For me, the mental picture is of a woman wearing an apron. She's standing at the sink with the washing up. There are lots of bubbles. Her hands are in the sink doing the washing up, and the bubbles are going up to her elbows. And then you detect a little chaining her there to the kitchen sink. It sounds like a very negative image, a woman as the man's helper. Well, the Hebrew word there, translated helper, is the word Ezer. And it may interest you to know that throughout the Old Testament, other than in this example of Eve being called Isa. That word, that title, is attributed to God. God describes himself as humanity's Isa. He is our helper. In other words, this is not an image of subjugation or domination. In the Old Testament, a woman, Eve, is the recipient of the first redemptive promise of the Bible. The promise that a Messiah will come, will be born into the world through her, and that Messiah will crush the serpent's head. The promise that evil will be defeated by someone who will be born into human history is given to a woman. The primary teaching text of the Old Testament, describing a female role model, doesn't conform to one stereotype of a downtrodden woman. Proverbs 31 speaks of a woman who lacks nothing of value. This is a woman who assesses and then buys and sells property independently. This is a woman who is entrepreneurial. This is a woman who employs multiple people. She's described as working hard. She provides well for her employees as well as her family. She plants a vineyard. That means that she plans ahead and implements strategy. This is a woman who studies as a scholar and has the capacity to teach others with wisdom. She embraces the intellectual life. This woman cares and provides for the poor. She lives engaged with social justice. She commands the respect of influential people and is loved by her own family. She's a creative person, designing and making beautiful clothes, fashion, and home furnishing. She's able to laugh at the future rather than fearing it. She's described as exercising authority, of being respected, and speaking wisely in a way that encourages others. That's the role model of a woman who is respected and held up as an example to other women. In the Old Testament, women were sometimes called to be prophetesses. That means that they were God's mouthpieces in the world. Miriam, Deborah, Isaiah's wife, a woman called Huldah, are examples of people who fulfilled that role. Women and men are equal before God in prayer in the Old Testament. Women pray directly to God. They don't need a mediation by their husband or their father. Now, of course, it's true to say that the Old Testament contains stories in which terrible things happen to women, such as rape and violence. But these are not condoned. It's important to remember when we read the Old Testament that much of it is narrative and not didactic in style. And when an author doesn't comment to make a moral comment on what has been recorded, particular instances are neither condoned nor condemned. A reader is left and encouraged to draw a conclusion on the basis of the accounts. As we read the laws of the Old Testament, we read an ancient text given at and for a particular time when societies were patriarchal. And Christians read that text through the lens of Jesus, who brings an era to an end, fulfilling the civil and ceremonial law of the Old Testament. In these ancient texts, we find that the sufferings of women are empathized with. That's extraordinary when you examine texts of the same era, where women are not spoken of in this same kind of way, with empathy or tenderness and their sufferings relayed for us. Women aren't just the subject of compassion and tenderness, though. Women in the Old Testament are also held up as heroic figures. Deborah in the book of Judges is a leader of a nation who even leads armies into the battlefield. And perhaps most strikingly, feminine imagery is used in the Old Testament to describe God. In Isaiah chapter 42, God draws an analogy between himself and a warrior, and then between himself and a woman giving birth. Now, unlike when I was talking to the girls this morning, in this room, I can look around and I can be pretty sure that there are women in this room who have given birth and men in this room who've been present at a birth. This is an extraordinary, graphic portrait of God using earthy language from the realm of female experience. God also characterizes himself in Isaiah chapter 66 in this way: as a mother comforts her child, so will I comfort you. In the New Testament, there's a substantial and significant shift in the way that women are spoken about and to. The context, the cultural context into which the New Testament is written, is opened up to our view by a telling little statement that happens in verse 27 of chapter 4 of John's Gospel. The disciples come across Jesus during a conversation that he's having with a Samaritan woman next to a well. And this little verse tells us his disciples returned and were astonished to find... What were they astonished to find? A miracle. Jesus walking on water. Were they astonished to see a supernatural occurrence? No. They were astonished to find him talking with a woman. That is the context into which Jesus' ministry occurs. In that context, Jesus calls and has female disciples. In a culture where the idea of women travelling around with a group of men or having the status of a disciple was seriously questionable, Jesus has a number of women who are included in his travelling circle. Luke's gospel names these women for us: Mary called Magdalene, Joanna the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. These women are mentioned by name and they're described as financially contributing to this ministry of Jesus. What a sharp contrast with a contemporary author, Ben Sirach of Jerusalem, who sums up the cultural attitude of his day in a statement like this: bad temper, insolence and shame hold sway where the wife supports the husband. Jesus, in contrast with that, travels with women in his group of disciples and allows them to contribute financially to the needs of the group. We also see not just Jesus having female disciples, but Jesus specifically inviting women into a rabbi, scholar, student relationship. In Luke chapter 10, verse 38, we read of Mary who sits at the feet of Jesus. Now, in first century Judaism, rabbis often gathered groups of students or disciples who would sit at their feet to learn the Torah. This privilege of study under the tutelage of a rabbi was strictly for men only, and it actually remained so until very recently. Men studied the Torah and women did the housework. Mary, by sitting at the feet of Jesus to learn and to listen to his word, is assuming the role of a rabbinical student, a role that was culturally reserved for men, a scholarly role. Now, it's interesting that in the text, it's a woman who objects to this. Martha sees what is happening and objects. She wants Mary's help with the practical tasks that she was doing. But Jesus resists Martha's intervention and encourages Mary to continue in this theological instruction. Now it's interesting, later on in John's Gospel, in chapter 11, after Lazarus has died, we read of Martha, Mary's sister, being the one who comes out to meet him, and it's Mary who stays in the domestic sphere. Martha comes out to meet Jesus, and she is the first person to be taught one of the most astounding statements, theological statements of the New Testament. A statement that you'll be familiar with if you've been to a funeral. A statement that Jesus makes to her when there is no male present to be the recipient of this theology. He makes this statement to a woman. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies." In contrast to the cultural norms of the time, Jesus appears to make a habit of revealing tremendous theological truths to women. "I am the resurrection and the life," to Martha. The first person to discover Christ's true identity in John's Gospel, that Samaritan woman at the well. The woman said, "I know the Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." And Jesus declared, "I who speak to you am he." We must not underestimate how radical this is. Not only does Jesus say and invite women to be scholars, to study theology, he reveals uniquely to women theological truths that we can only know today because those women witnessed them. Not only does Jesus act in a countercultural manner, affirming women, he also teaches and speaks about women in a new and fresh way. I think we all know that we detect racism and sexism more often in the incidental way people speak about other people than in direct statements they make. People are more guarded about direct statements they make, but often it's detectable, their prejudice is detectable in the incidental way they speak and behave. And what we see in Jesus' teaching in parables is that he often couples two parables together. And they're drawn from the life and vocation and the everyday experience of male and female. So one example would be the parable of the mending of the garment. An everyday image from an average female vocation is coupled with the parable of the making of the wine, an everyday image from the average male vocation. But Jesus perhaps goes further than this. In his teaching, he actually portrays God in feminine form as well as in masculine form. In Luke 15, Jesus follows a parable about a shepherd searching for a lost sheep with a parable about a woman searching for a lost coin. God is depicted as a shepherd who goes after that one sheep that has been lost. And God is depicted as a woman down on her hands and knees on the floor of her house, searching for a coin that has been lost. This was radically countercultural at the time. But perhaps more important than any of these examples I've given is the role that women play as prominent historic witnesses to the central events surrounding Jesus Christ. Mary is the only witness to the annunciation of the virgin birth of Christ. If you think about the doctrine of the incarnation, the idea that God will take flesh and come and dwell among us as a human being, you'll understand the magnitude of the importance of the fact that that was primarily witnessed by a woman. Secondly, it's a group of women who stood at the foot of the cross. The male disciples, the gospel accounts tell us, deserted Jesus. The only male disciple who didn't desert Jesus mentioned in one of the gospels is John. It's the female disciples who are there, standing close to the cross, witnessing the details of the crucifixion, which then appear in the gospel accounts. Details of the crucifixion like the 7 words spoken from the cross. Details of the crucifixion like the Roman soldiers gambling over the robe of Jesus at the foot of the cross. The incarnation and the crucifixion primarily witnessed by women. And then thirdly, it is women who are first at the empty tomb. The first witnesses to the resurrection of Christ are female. Now, it's striking for us to remember that the word of women was perceived as having less value than that of men. So it's enormously important that these significant events of Jesus' life, identity, death, and resurrection were witnessed firsthand primarily by women. It's unconscionable in the ancient world that were one to fabricate a fictional account and try to propagate it as historical, it's unconscionable that one would choose female witnesses to that account. That would be lunacy. So this is actually good evidence that the gospel accounts are historical. But as we take a step back from that point of view, and notice the prominence of women within the Christian faith as witnesses to these primary aspects of theology, it's actually astounding. After all, what is Christianity without Christ? One of my colleagues likes to say, if you take Christ out of Christian, you're left with the letters IAN, and Ian can't help us very much. Dorothy L. Sayers noted that Jesus met lots of women, so he did give us a direct line on them. And the most remarkable thing, though nobody seems to have noticed it, is that alone among teachers and founders of religion, he did and said nothing special about them. He never said they were tempters or snares or weaklings or imbeciles or inspirations or angels. He never mapped out a special sphere of duties for them, or told people to keep clear of them or shut them up when they asked him intelligent questions. He replied seriously and intelligibly. He never patronised or condescended or scolded or nagged at women for being women, or turned shy or silly or self-conscious or superior on them. You could read the whole gospel from end to end without learning from it that there was anything peculiar about women, or that mankind was divided into 2 sections, the one consisting of complete human beings with certain sexual functions, and the other of perambulating sex organs with a distant resemblance to humanity. You don't realise how extraordinary that is. It is unparalleled. There never has been anything like it before or since. There certainly never has been anything like it in Christ's church. This conviction that Jesus demonstrated how women should be regarded and treated led to the finale of her essay, The Human Not Quite Human. And she presented the church of her generation with a challenge to consider. Perhaps it is no wonder that the women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They never had known a man like this man. There never has been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronised, who never made arch jokes about them, never treated them as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without querulousness, praised without condescension, and took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. And so one question comes to us today: what will we do with the testimony and witness of those women who've passed on to us the story of the incarnation of God, his atoning death and his resurrection? And in our context of women objectified as objects, susceptible to self-objectification, and increasingly pursued as the targets of sexual aggression, the humanity of women is what is at stake. That is what psychologists and sociologists tell us. And it's precisely into this question that Jesus Christ speaks, upholding that Genesis ideal of male and female, created in the image of God, human life as sacred, precious, having transcendent value as male and female. Christ enacted that truth in his treatment of women. But what about the church? When we come to look at the place of women in the early church, we actually see, and it may be surprising to know, that the New Testament ascribes numerous different roles to women. We meet women who are teachers of theology. An example comes in Acts chapter 18, where Apollos is taught by a couple named Priscilla and Aquila. Apollos is a famous and eloquent preacher. And Priscilla, her name coming first, which is very unusual in the ancient world as it actually is today in a married couple, is there. She's emphasised that she plays this critical teaching role. Luke's gospel, of course, presents Mary as a teacher of theology with that vision of ethics and social justice in her Magnificat that is recorded for us. Women are presented as deacons of the church. Romans chapter 16 introduces us to Phoebe as a deacon or the deacon of the church. The Greek there has the masculine form diakonon, showing that Phoebe is a deacon and not a deaconess. One writer says, we regard it as virtually certain that Phoebe is being described as the deacon of the church in question, and that this occurrence of diakonos is to be classified with its other occurrences in Philippians 1 and 1 Timothy 3. The title in its male form given to Phoebe as a formal title. And then, as if to emphasise this, Paul goes on to describe Phoebe with the Greek word prostatis over many, including Paul himself. This word prostatis occurs only here in the New Testament, but in other Greek literature of the time, it's translated in the following way: leader, ruler, protector, or president. Paul, the so-called misogynist, describes Phoebe as the ruler, protector, president, or leader, including over himself. He seems to be strongly affirming the ministry of women here and describing what the New Testament church was like. Women are also prophets in the New Testament, exercising that key public ministry role in the early church. Philip is commended having 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied in Acts chapter 21. Women play all kinds of roles, from Lydia to Tabitha to Philip's daughters. Of course, people often leap on to passages that seem to contravene everything that I've said. 1 Corinthians 14, which talks about women being silent, and 1 Timothy 2, which tells women to be silent and not to teach. The 1 Corinthians passage needs to be read in its context, where only 2 chapters earlier, Paul has described the manner in which women should speak when they are speaking publicly, giving prophecies. They should cover their hair, which was a sign of respect. So we see that in this context, Paul is writing a letter into a particular situation, dealing with disturbances. In 1 Timothy 2, perhaps more controversial, it's taken by some to mean that women should never teach or have authority in any church. But as we've seen, that seems to go against the rest of the teaching of the New Testament, much of which the Apostle Paul himself wrote. And so many scholars argue that this passage written to Timothy must be understood in its geographical and cultural context. The context of the city of Ephesus, where the goddess Artemis was worshipped and where women dominated men in the cultic life of the temple. The Ephesian church would have recruited from the temple of this goddess Artemis. And so Paul is addressing an issue that had crept into the Ephesian church with these women, saying that these particular women perpetuating violence and domination against men, bringing that from Artemis's temple into the church, shouldn't teach or have authority in that church. The Apostle Paul, who's often demonized as sexist, in fact, freely welcomed, spoke of, encouraged the ministry of women in the early church. You can ask questions later if you want to. Jesus was radically countercultural in his positive treatment of women, and the early church seemed to be pretty good at following his example. Patriarchy is not a logical outworking of Jesus' teaching, and that is why faithful Christians of every generation have resisted it. Truth matters. Ideas have consequences. If male and female are equal image bearers of the divine image, underpinning the sacredness of human life, the outworkings of this will be practical. In the same way, if we as human beings are just slime, the collections of atoms here by chance, through a process of the strong eliminating the weak, there is no reason to be overly concerned about the domination or subjugation of other human beings. We just need to make sure we're not on the receiving end of it. The specifics of life are directly impacted by the patterns, the philosophies that we choose to follow and implement. If, rather than male and female equally reflecting the image of God in their shared humanity, women and men are both demeaned by a reductionist view of women as a separate class economically dependent on men, or women restricted in their spheres of activity and creativity on the basis of arbitrary cultural prejudice, or women reduced simply to their biological function because, after all, we're just biology. If that is the case, we should expect to see the consequences of it in our society, and I suggest today that we do. The Christian claim that a divine pattern for humanity, male and female, equally human, reflecting the image of God, is upheld in the ministry of Jesus. God, incarnate in human history, invited women to be first at his cradle and last at his cross. He underpins an expansive vision of human flourishing, in which the value of all human life is undergirded by that transcendent source. Where the church may have failed women, Christ, as the truth incarnate, gave us that perfect pattern as to how to affirm the full humanity of women. In fact, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised or to be disappointed by Christianity. After all, as one of my friends, Dr. Elaine Stalky, puts it, the church recruits from the human race. Therefore, we're not surprised by negative behaviours by individuals or institutions, but I suggest that we will not be disappointed by Christ. Is Christianity bad news for women? Well, is it bad news for human beings? We need to check that out for ourselves, and we might be surprised by what we discover. One of Britain's leading atheists is a journalist called Matthew Paris, who writes for The Times and The Spectator. And he went back to visit the place of his birth a few years ago now and wrote a piece reflecting on his experiences of going back to Africa as an adult. And as an atheist, he was quite struck by the kind of Christianity that he observed, and he wrote this: "Now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. Sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects and international aid efforts. These alone will not do, Education and training alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. He goes on, I used to avoid this truth by applauding as you can the practical work of mission churches in Africa. It's a pity, I would say, that salvation is part of the package, but Christians, black and white, working in Africa, do heal the sick, do teach people to read and write, and only the severest kind of secularist would see a mission hospital or school and say, the world would be better without it. I would allow that if faith was needed to motivate missionaries to help, then fine, but what counted was the help, not the faith. But this doesn't fit the facts. Faith does more than support the missionary. It's also transferred to his flock. And that is the effect that matters so immensely and which I cannot help observing. Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. Is Christianity bad news for women? Not if you look at Jesus Christ. Women are welcomed, taught, spoken of as equally human. Women are witnesses to the primary facts of the Christian story: incarnation, atonement, resurrection. Women in the early church played significant roles in biblical literature, teaching, prophesying, witnessing, providing, and leading. Women went to their deaths in the amphitheatre, martyred as the Christian men were. And I'll conclude this lecture with the words of one such woman, Perpetua, a noble Christian woman born in Carthage in 181 AD. The record of the passion of Saint Perpetua and Saint Felicitas and their companions is said to preserve the actual words of the martyrs and their friends. In the year 203, during the persecutions of the Emperor Septimus Severus, 5 catechumens were arrested for their faith, and this included Perpetua, aged 22, and her servant girl Felicitas. Perpetua's father was not a Christian, and he tried to persuade her to deny this name Christian for herself in order to save her life. And she said, "Father, do you see this vessel here, a pitcher or whatsoever it may be?" And he said, "I see it." And I said to him, "Can it be called by any other name than that which it is?" And he answered, "No. So can I call myself naught other than that which I am, a Christian?" She was wounded by a bull in the amphitheatre, and then the martyrs were gathered into the centre to be killed by the sword of a gladiator. She exhorted the other Christians to stand fast in the faith and love one another. And the gladiator was too afraid to kill her, so she guided his hand and the sword to her own throat and helped him finish the job. A courageous Christian woman. Women equally went to their deaths in the amphitheatre. Women and men equally bear the image of God as fully human, with all the privileges and challenges of living as human beings. Christianity is good news for women, just as it is good news for men, with a coherent worldview underpinning a vision of human flourishing. Women are no more or less in need of salvation, not reduced to biological function or a particular role or sphere or level of humanity. Women are divine image bearers alongside men, invited to become children of God. And as for all of us, this is largely on the basis of the testimony of other women about Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening.